Okay, everyone, I think we can start. Welcome to the Center for Migration Studies briefing, National Interest and Common Ground in the U.S. Immigration Debate, Legal Immigration Reform versus Mass Deportation and the Wall. I'm Rachel Reyes, CMS's Director of Communications. This briefing will cover two competing visions of U.S. immigration policy, one characterized by legal immigration reform and the other by mass deportation policies and the proposed 2,000-mile border wall. These visions are analyzed in three recent papers by our presenters today, CMS's Donald Kerwin and Robert Warren, which are published in our public policy journal, the Journal on Migration and Human Security. The papers are Mass Deportations Would Impoverish U.S. Families and Create Immense Social Costs, The 2,000-Mile Wall in Search of a Purpose. Since 2007, visa overstays have outnumbered undocumented border crossers by 500,000, and National Interest and Common Ground in the U.S. Immigration Debate, How to Legalize the U.S. Immigration System and Permanently Reduce its Undocumented Population. This last paper is part of our project, the CMS U.S. Immigration Reform Initiative, which looks beyond current immigration debates to offer analysis, ideas, and proposals for fixing the U.S. immigration system. So I will now introduce Donald Kerwin, CMS's Executive Director. And just one last thing, though, if you could please mute yourself when you're not talking to minimize background noise, that would help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. So Bob Warren and I cleverly characterized our paper as a paper on how to legalize the U.S. immigration system and permanently reduce its undocumented population. And we're mostly going to talk about the paper today and its vision of replacing a system characterized by dysfunction with one that would serve important national interests and permanently reduce the undocumented population. The centerpiece of our proposal involves legal immigration reform. We're not proposing changes in particular visa categories or numbers in this paper, but reform in the underlying structure of the system. We're going to lay out that vision and then compare it to the enforcement-only vision of reform, which the new administration is championing. The common ground in our title involves the public's desire and actually the desire of partisans on both sides of this debate for a legal, orderly system that serves national interests. I'm going to speak on legal immigration reform. I'll hand it off to Bob to speak on the undocumented, and then I'll circle back to speak on some policy recommendations, and Bob will finish by speaking on the alternative vision of mass deportations, a border wall, and a reduced commitment to refugees, although we're not going to get into refugee issues. And we'll try to leave some time at the end for questions. The paper starts with an analysis of presidential signing statements of seminal immigration legislation over the last century as a way to identify the national interests and values that underlie our immigration system. And we also look at President Truman's statement on vetoing the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. This veto was overridden. What we found, excluding the discriminatory national origins legislation of 1924, was a remarkable degree of consistency and consensus on the goals and purposes of our laws. And this slide reveals them. So, preservation of families, non-discrimination, fairness and process, U.S. tradition as a haven for refugees, the way in which immigrants embody self-sufficiency and hard work, and further the nation's competitiveness, the right of all U.S. residents to the benefits of a free and open society, and then the need for a system characterized by fair, orderly, and secure migration, which upholds the rule of law, and resistance and concern related to unauthorized migration is a challenge to sovereignty and security, and the notion of citizenship, and of course, concerns related to criminality and security as well. Beyond serving these interests, we also identified several characteristics of an effective and reformed system. And one has to do with improved migration governance. And here we're making the point that none of the interests served by immigration policies, family, economic, or humanitarian, none of those interests can be achieved only by immigration policies. And thus, migration and refugee concerns have to be incorporated into broader policy responses, both foreign policy responses and domestic policies that promote immigrant integration. We also argue, building on a lot of work that's being done at the UN or through the UN, that the immigration system can also promote the work of diasporas through circular migration policies and in other ways, and contributing to in their efforts to contribute to the well-being of their communities of origin through disaster relief, economic development, and in other ways. The U.S. also needs to distinguish between undocumented migration and refugee and humanitarian flows and treat those two types of migration differently. Like many of the migrants driven over the last 5 years from the violence-plagued Northern Triangle states are actually refugees, and they need to be treated as such. These U.S. policies, we argue, U.S. policies will be more likely to be successful if they enjoy the cooperation of other states, states of origin and transit, and they're more likely to get cooperation if they benefit those states, or at least don't discriminate against their nationals. So the outline of potential win-win labor migration policies can be seen in these two slides, which show the growing percentage of working-age immigrants and the growing percentage of elderly Americans spurred by the 76 million baby boomers. We'll need, and we do need, younger immigrant workers to help shore up our federal retirement programs and to meet our labor needs. We also need coherent policies, and we need to remove the many barriers to legal status that exists in our current system. As Madeline Zavadny and Tia Arrhenius recently argued in a paper that they wrote for our Journal on Migration and Human Security, the U.S. regularly creates immigration laws and procedures that lead to the need for more visas, but they make no provision for actually meeting those needs. The last major legalization program, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, for example, did not provide for derivative status for the family members of beneficiaries. So, there's now more than 4 million persons who've been determined to have a close family relationship that qualified them for a visa, but most languish in backlogs. We also, and once their number becomes available, they're going to have to leave the country for consular processing, and they'll face bars on admission, re-entry, which is really a significant barrier to people who are eligible for status actually being able to legalize their status. And there's a lot of other examples of these kinds of policies, including the one-year filing rule on political asylum cases, and we talk about those in the paper. I think part of the disgust with our immigration system is based on the perception that it doesn't serve the interests we want it to. And this isn't surprising, since our legal immigration policies haven't been meaningfully reformed for 27 years. Assuming that broad immigration reform will not be a regular occurrence, and U.S. needs and global realities will change substantially between passage of major legislation, we particularly need a system that can adjust admission priorities and numbers between passage of laws, and that relies on current data and research. And these kinds of proposals have been proposed by Migration Policy Institute, Ray Marshall, and others, is a way to kind of align U.S. immigration policies more closely with U.S. labor and economic needs. And yet, we lack a formal independent body of this kind that has been proposed and that exists in other nations. And that kind of body would advise Congress and the executive on evolving labor, family, and humanitarian needs that could be met through immigration, It would identify shortages in skills and occupation. It would propose adjustments at admission levels and categories. And it would also do research, I think, and this is very important, and we've just published a paper by Emily Rio on this, on the actual views of immigrants on U.S. immigration policies in order to strengthen the legal immigration system and allow us to better understand and address noncompliance with the law. That's the kind of work that a commission could do. Let me say, too, that we also need evidence-based refugee and humanitarian immigration policies. Many states and international actors produce reports, indices, and state rankings on many of the conditions that force people to migrate. And yet these resources and this data doesn't inform our refugee or broader humanitarian policies, and we recommend that it should. So let me turn now to Bob, who will provide an analysis of the U.S. undocumented population and will show the long tenure of the current population and the need for a registry program.
I'd like you to keep in mind, as I describe what I think of as the rise and fall of the undocumented population, is that the underlying factor behind the growth and the drop of the undocumented population is a failure to make adequate policies to deal with the growing situation. And I'll start by summarizing what happened, how the population started growing, and it began to grow in the 1970s. And that happened for basically three different reasons. One, the Bracero program, which is the temporary worker program with Mexico, ended. In 1968, numerical limits were put on immigration for the first time from the Western Hemisphere. And the main thing is that there was no information about this growing undocumented population. There were huge exaggerations, mostly, well, partly out of ignorance and partly because with the hope of getting budget increases. And so what happened in the 1970s and 80s was that actually INS at the time, they actually got their increases. They kept increasing the enforcement at the border. And essentially what they did was to turn a temporary flow into permanent residence in the U.S. As it became harder and harder to go back and forth, the undocumented immigrants started more and more to stay. And if you look at figure 3, that's the figure kind of shows the origins of the flow. And you see that the Bracero program ended in 1964. And after that, the number of apprehensions started to really increase there by 1970. Now, figure 4 shows how the population increased over the last 45 years. So it was only 2.3 million in 1980, and it grew to about 12 million in 2008 before it started to drop. And the reason that it started to drop is probably the biggest unreported story in our media for years, is that the number coming in from Mexico started to fall after 2000, and it dropped really dramatically all the way from 2000 down to just a few years ago. And that's reflected in figure 5. You see that the population grew back in the 90s and around 2000. And then in 2000, population growth started to just really fall off the table. And again, that's mostly because undocumented immigration from Mexico fell so rapidly. Now, I'd like to just say something about why the population grew so fast. I've already said that it's partly because we turned a temporary flow into a permanent immigration. But the other thing that happened was that we failed to keep updating the registry. And for those of you who don't know, for about 90 years, we've had part of the immigration law has been to have what they call a registry system. If you've been in the country for around 15 or 20 years, you're able to legalize your status. And as Table 1 shows, the average years between changing the date and when you were eligible was about 15 years. So that went on until the Immigration Act of 1986, IRCA, and after that, this updating got frozen. It hasn't been changed for 45 years. So that's one of the reasons why the population grew is that mechanism wasn't available. The figure 7 shows how many would be eligible if we were to, let's say in 2017, we were to move up the registry date and we were to say that if you came in, for example, if you came in 2002, there would be 5 million people who would be eligible to legalize. So essentially, about half of the undocumented population really wouldn't be undocumented if we had kept updating the registry. The other aspect that I wanted to mention about the growth of the population at this point, it has to do with the report that we just put out within the last month having to do with overstays. And this has been news to a lot of reporters and the public that we have such a high percentage of undocumented immigrants who have come in on temporary visas and then overstayed and established residence here. This is not a new phenomenon, and in our report we showed what here is figure 6. Rachel, I don't know if you have that on the screen.
Yes.
But figure 6 shows the percentage of the population that were overstays all the way back to 1980, and you'll see that it's always been around 40 to 45% in that range. But it hasn't been recognized because there hasn't been data. It's really difficult to estimate that number. I mean, it's hard enough to estimate the undocumented population, much less break it into overstays and what we call EWIs, or people who essentially came across the southern border. The other table that I wanted to show you is figure 1, and it shows a more current picture of the overstays, and it shows that in the last, say, 10 years, overstaying has been the predominant way of coming into the country. And so I think at that point, I'll just stop for a second there and let Don take over for a minute, and then I'll talk about the other aspects that Don mentioned at the end.
Thank you, Bob. So we've already, I hope you heard most of it, but we've already gone through a number of policy recommendations. But let me just kind of repeat that what we propose in this paper is the creation of a coherent, fact-based legal immigration system that can adapt in real time to changed U.S. needs and priorities, and that, of course, reflects its values. And our basic insight is that legal immigration reform needs to be the centerpiece of broader reform, because the U.S. system can't reliably advance any of the nation's interests for its immigration system without legal immigration reform. And we argue that legal immigration reform will be key to ensuring that a legalization program doesn't lead to another immense undocumented population. In addition, without effective reform, our immigration enforcement system will continue to face a difficult, almost insurmountable task, and will continue to work at cross purposes to the very interests, family unity, family integrity, economic interests, labor interests, and humanitarian interests that our overall immigration system is intended to serve. Bob and I, in a series of papers over the last few years, have argued for a legalization program based on the long tenure and the strong equitable ties of the undocumented to the U.S. and the transitional nature of immigration status in the United States. The fact that people that are now undocumented many of them will ultimately become or receive legal status. So it doesn't hurt to go through who's actually in this population. And the picture is very different from the one that we often hear in the press. Of the 11 million, a high percentage of them, 4.26 million, are people that have been tentatively approved for family-based visas and are in visa backlogs. Perhaps 15 to 20% may be eligible for an immigration benefit or relief, but don't know it or can't afford to pursue it, and there's research being done on that right now. A large number who will ultimately fall out of this status are undocumented now. We, between 1982 and 2012, 6.5 million left the United States, were removed or died. So they basically, you know, are not part of the undocumented population now. And then there's many with long-term residence, 1.9 million with 20 years or more of residence. People with family ties, 3.9 million parents of U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents, and 2.5 million undocumented who were brought to the United States at age 15 or under. I mean, the basic point here is that it wouldn't be a proportional punishment to deport people in these various categories, and it would be disastrous to U.S. families, communities, and interests. However, many argue that a legalization program will lay the groundwork for another large undocumented population, as IRCA, our last big legalization program, did. Our paper disagrees with that, and it argues that the mistakes of IRCA, to the extent that there were mistakes, are not really what its critics typically say that they are, and that they need not be revisited in any event. Basically, IRCA, as this list indicates, failed to legalize enough people, and it didn't reform the underlying legal immigration system, among other problems. You know, it also failed to adequately or aggressively enforce employer verification and sanctions programs. But basically, we feel that these mistakes are known now, and they don't need to be revisited. Our report included a number of proposals, including legal immigration reform and advancing the registry date, on how to keep the undocumented population low after a legalization program. We have a number of additional proposals in the paper related to the rigidity and the lack of discretion in U.S. immigration law. And we're publishing later this week or early next week a piece by Lenny Benson of New York Law School on these various issues. So that's our vision. That's our vision that we lay out in this paper that was released yesterday. And let me now turn to Bob to talk about the other vision, which is the enforcement-only vision of walls and mass deportations, and the two reports that we produced on the particular consequences of that vision.
Thanks, Don. We recently published a report that started out to be a report about mixed status households. That is, households that had one U.S.-born child and one undocumented immigrant. And we spent quite a bit of time analyzing the data for those mixed status households. But what happened to that report was, as we looked into it more and more, we found what I consider to be really alarming aspects of the idea of mass deportation. And so what we found was that if there was a mass deportation program, which is one of the main legs of the proposed policies of the new president, if there was such a mass deportation program, it would be devastating to these families. There are 3.3 million households in this country that have undocumented immigrants who have U.S. citizens, who have U.S.-born children, and there are about 6 million U.S.-born children living in households with undocumented immigrants. What we found is that if the undocumented immigrants were removed, it would cut family income by half, putting a large percentage of people into poverty and in really bad shape economically. But what we also found was that if that happened, the U.S. children left behind, the cost of raising those children would be more than $100 billion to the people in this country. The second major, the second major negative impact of that would be that the mortgages of the people, the mortgages that are held by the undocumented immigrants, there are 2.4 million mortgages held by undocumented immigrants. Those would all be in peril if there was a mass deportation program. And to put that in perspective, during the height of the Great Recession, there were about 3 million foreclosures a year. So if all of a sudden we had a program to deport everybody, then 2.4 million mortgages would be in peril. And finally, the other finding was that removing those workers and those undocumented residents would cost the U.S. GDP to drop by $4.7 trillion over the next 10 years. So if that could be carried out, which who knows whether it can be done, it would be devastating to the U.S. economy and to the people involved and to their families. Now, in terms of the wall, that subject came up as a result of our analysis of overstays, and we found that in 2014, 2/3 of the new arriving immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are coming in basically on airplanes. They're coming in with legal visas and they're overstaying. So in terms of the wall, it would be extremely expensive. It's not the way most undocumented immigrants arrive now. And maybe more than anything else, I personally would consider it a symbol of national failure in terms of policy making. It's just a bad idea. And I think with that personal statement, I'll just stop and I'll say that I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, everyone. Well, we have 15 minutes for question and answer. Earlier I had said type your questions in the chat box, but unfortunately we can't actually access that from this computer. So if you could just unmute yourself, speak up, ask your question, and then mute yourself, that would be great. Any questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I can.
My question,
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, my name is Steve Kramer. I have a question about maybe if you have any information regarding 11 million undocumented and what percentage of those folks actually have jobs that have enabled them then to become members of their communities and establish themselves with family and friends.
And this is Bob. I can answer that. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I will say that we've looked at the unemployment rate of undocumented immigrants, and it's very similar to workers in the U.S. It's about it was around 6% a year or two ago, and it's probably a little lower than that now. But we did find that the unemployment rate was about the same as the entire U.S. population. The median income of families, I think, was about 10,000 less than the median of the entire country. So they're doing pretty well, and I think that's partly due to the fact they've been here a long time. 65%, 2/3 maybe have been here for more than 10 years. So they're doing reasonably well as far as that's concerned.
One point that I wanted to make too is that another argument that we make related to the coherence of U.S. immigration policies is that part of reforming U.S. policies so that they are coherent is to acknowledge the nation's particular responsibility for people that have been displaced by other U.S. policies, whether they're military commitments or trade agreements or whatever. And until we kind of get our heads around that and acknowledge those responsibilities, I think it's going to be difficult to have an immigration system that we're all proud of and that's really serves the interest that we want it to.
Don, this is Bob. I would add one more item that we recommended that we didn't mention here yet. We recommended setting up a visa category that essentially would reuse immigrant visas of immigrants who had come here before and had emigrated. And emigration from the U.S. is a subject that you hear very little about, but in our history, essentially 30 to 40% of even legal immigrants eventually leave the country. And our idea was to use the average number who have left over the last few decades, which is 250,000, to set that up as a category to reduce backlogs and to adjust people. So I just thought I'd mention that.
It's a very important point, I think, because it's an argument on how you reform the law without necessarily increasing the number of visas.
Can I continue a question about the children?
Sure.
Sure.
One of the things, I'm Father Michael McAndrew in Greenwood, Mississippi, and we have issues of urgent, immediate, what I would consider endangerment of the children. I was glad you brought up about the costs of the children who are U.S. citizens whose parents could be deported. We have two cases of children right now that ICE took the people in and left the wife, the mother with the children with no care, no provisions for the food, health care, or anything like that. Is there anything going on a national level to concern for the reckless, I call it reckless endangerment of children whose parents are in the process of detention or deportation?
Actually, I don't know of any statistics that have been collected, any surveys that have been done, but I can just tell you from my personal experience, I have a friend in New York City who is in the process of making arrangements, to take over responsibility for the children of someone that she knows who may face deportation. So I think there's anxiety all over the country about this.
I should say too that the study that we did on mass deportations, we assumed that that the deported member, undocumented member of the mixed status households provided about 50% of the household income, and that only a third of the children in those households would remain, both of which we thought were very conservative assumptions in the event of a deportation of a parent. And even with those conservative assumptions, the actual cost of raising, the missing cost of raising those children was $118 billion. If the assumptions had been maybe more realistic, the number would be even higher. So what we're talking about is a real crisis and a tragedy.
I think that I'm Father McAndrew again, one of the things that I noticed was the case of Marisol Trujillo in Cincinnati, the child with asthma that was separated from her mother. And I think that's happening a lot. And I just wanted to know if there's any actions being done by people in defense of people like Marisol and her family, or if I could get in touch with anybody who might be addressing this.
Well, the Justice for Immigrants campaign, is Father, as you know, kind of was very active on that particular case. And
yes,
the Archdiocese of Cincinnati was. So, and there's a number of other groups that are heavily involved in those particular kinds of cases.
I'll contact them again on this one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions, comments?
I have another question.
Okay.
I have another question. Is there anything that you have done in your paper regarding a recommendation and how going forward we can eliminate or reduce this dynamic that we have where undocumented people are able to get jobs, and then they have families, and then they establish roots, and then we end up with a situation where we have to just tragically separate families. I mean, is there any way to prevent the problem from happening where there's a major incentive to hire people without documentation? And I'm not saying that's creating the situation that we're in, where we have millions of people that are working, they're employed, their kids are going to school, they're having families, and now we have this tragedy of just massive separation looming.
Yeah, I think that the answer to that is legal immigration reform. It's been 27 years since the 1990 Immigration Act, and 52 years or 53 years since the last major overhaul, in 1965. And you have a situation where the number of permanent visas for lesser credentialed or lesser skilled people is 5,000. And yet you have large numbers. I think it's 8 million undocumented people working in the United States. So it's clear that that there needs to be an increase because in the number of visas in that category. But we really haven't reformed our legal immigration policies in many, many years. So that's really the main need, I think, in the way that you would avoid that problem. And then also reducing the barriers to legal status for people that are on a course to legal status, like those that have recognized family ties that would qualify them for a visa.
I'd like to add to that, if you don't mind. I think moving up the registry date and having it move up every year would contribute to that. But I also think that we shouldn't, in terms of the future, we need to recognize that undocumented immigration from Mexico is at a historic low. So that we hope that would not, increase the population in the future. So, and we're spending 15 or 20 billion dollars a year and doubling the border patrol about every 10 years. So in the future, we think that the population won't grow. The undocumented population has fallen by a million over the last 10 years. But also, instead of spending who knows how much money on a wall, some of that money could go to the State Department for better examination of visitor visas. And also, once we have a legalization program and so many people are not in danger, then we could seriously consider making E-Verify a much wider use to cut off the access to government. So those would be my ideas.
This is Lourdes Villanueva, and I'm calling from Florida. My question is, are there plans to present this information to elected officials who really seem to be walking on a fog when it comes to immigration? They just keep repeating the same thing that they hear with no basis. And so this is good information that I think would be very helpful if there's a plan to present to those people that will eventually, hopefully, one of these days, will pick up the courage to do something about immigration reform. Thank you.
The answer is that yes, in that this journal in which these various reports and papers have been published is a public policy journal, and it gets disseminated to policymakers. And we have a director of policy in Washington that lifts up recommendations in those settings too. But we really count on you too, and these articles, they all have very short executive summaries. They're packed with facts and graphs, and you can easily bring them to the attention of lawmakers as well, and we hope that you do.
We do, and we will. And it is at that time that we realized how ignorant they are, and they are the ones representing us. So that's the scary part. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I think we're up against close to our 45 minutes, which is what we've allotted for this. If there's no final questions, thank you very much for joining us, and
we'll have the recording of the briefing on our website, cmsny.org. where you can also access the 3 papers that were referenced in this webinar. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at cms@cmsny.org. Thank you.